Well, DeSantis strikes again with another slam on woke culture. Communism, if you're not aware, the interest in communism and the favor of communism has been rising among young people in the West and especially in the United States. And so DeSantis has decided to do something about that. The State Board of Education from Florida approved a new history of communism standard. And so they have these standards that are going to begin being implemented the 2026-27 school year, which means basically next in the fall of 2026, that school year. And so they've got some time to get the textbooks and things in order. But this was from Senate Bill 1264. And that's where he said that was signed into law in April 2024. So that's tasking the Department of Education with adding this the history of the dangers of communism to the curriculum. And so we can see I highlighted some interesting quotes here, but basically the next step is for the Florida education leaders to put those standards actually into the textbooks, like I said, and the instructions for the coming year. So what do you think? Is this the right direction, Troy?
From what I know about communism, it is, and the effects of communism. I mean, you can look at the studies that have been done. Communism is not necessarily the same thing as fascism. The most extreme examples of fascism or something like that, in that like a dictator can just go and kill whoever they want. It's not necessarily that, but the aftermath of it and the ways that people have died, the hundreds of millions of people that have died, based on bad leadership, like because of communist ideologies, and bad decisions overall when it comes to where the food is sourced from, who's working the fields, who's in charge of what aspects of society. It's overwhelmingly like evil, like communism in general. So it's like, shouldn't we, and even if that's only 90% of the time, or even if that's only 50% of the time, right? Shouldn't we show that? Shouldn't we say that? And that should have been there all along. And it's something we shouldn't have to add back into the text, right?
Yeah, if you're like me, my initial reaction when I saw that headline was, they're not teaching it in schools today? Like, what? And because, I mean, I learned about it, and I did the global reference check with my wife, who's from Brazil, and they also taught it in Brazil back in the day. I don't know about today because they're getting very friendly with China, but I learned all about communism and socialism, and it was not done in a favorable light in high school, grade school, or I think it was high school. But we see apparently there's a need for that. And there was a survey that was done, and we're going to talk about some specific personal cases here, but there was a survey that was done that shows that 2/3 of young Americans have a favorable view of socialism. That's 62%. One survey found, and 34% those are Americans under 30. Okay. And so you can see the age gap there. 34% of 18 to 29-year-olds say they have a favorable view of communism. So the thing is, these surveys don't define communism and socialism. And so a lot of people, what they may think is, oh, well, yeah, everybody should have free healthcare, everybody should have free food, and everybody should get a basic income, which is not what communism is. It's, it's a takeover of the private, the means of production. Mm-hmm. And taking land and all of that and all those sorts of things. So, but still,
you no longer own anything. Essentially, the government owns it, and you have no rights. Like your rights are, hopefully you live.
Right. Like that's right.
It's not great. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no rights. They can trample anything. And the fact that overall, another survey I saw says that 80% of Americans still hold an unfavorable view of communism, but that means overall 20% of Americans have a favorable view of communism, which is just insanity to me. It doesn't make any sense to me. But one of the things I thought was interesting, this is from this Rod Martin report, and they interviewed some Cubans that actually moved here, and they welcome this new curriculum update, and they said, there's some quotes here, but basically this Mariana Cotana said that she's concerned about the growing influence of communism across the United States. And she said the problem is not limited to young people, and pointed that adults with similar beliefs are already serving in politics and in education. So that's a big issue. Very influential positions with people holding these positions. Now, whether they really do or whether they are just a puppet, it's sort of irrelevant. But she says the communists are here working little by little. And she says basically they can't come out of the closet yet, but they have to stay in the shadows for now. Mm. And so that is exactly how it works. And I'm going to give an example, but you can see there's these ideas of this ideal, and they'll say, oh, well, it hasn't been done right yet. They don't do it right. They're doing it wrong, and we need to keep trying it to get it right. But the principles on their face don't work. And that's the issue. It's not about doing it right or wrong. It's about you cannot just having a fully centralized system doesn't work. And if we look at China today, that is what we think of also as communism, but that's also it kind of has some capitalism aspects mixed in it. So you have free enterprising companies that can operate, but they are still under the jurisdiction of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. Right. They all have a CCP member on their board. They all can have information seized from the government at will, no questions, no rights, nothing. It is a communist regime, but they do have some free market principles baked in under the thumb of the communist regime. So they sort of take the best of the both worlds, best of one, worst of another, however you want to put it, and mix it together.
I think the problem is, they say, well, we haven't done socialism right? But the problem is they're thinking from a perspective, an ideological framework that doesn't exist, which is that the people at the top are going to be they're not going to be corrupt. They're going to be, I have your best interests in mind, right? And they're thinking from this perspective of it's going to be like an elementary classroom where the teacher is there to teach and instruct and help and lead, take all the kids to the lunchroom. It's like, and that's not, you're going to have corrupt leaders at the top. They're going to take advantage of the people. And once you give your rights away, you don't have the ability to fight back, and that's why a capitalist society, yes, has severe issues, right? We see that's why, people write stories. Charles Dickens wrote the whole Christmas Carol story because you have greed. Greed's a thing, right? And it's okay to push back against that. We should push back against that. People should be in jail for embezzling money, right? Mm. That's a thing, right? It's going to be part of it because that's part of human nature. But people assume if we just had this socialist structure in mind or this communist structure, that human nature would change, right? And it doesn't change. And you see, that's why it never works. It's like we've seen hundreds of millions of people die before. So why would you be willing to put us through that as a guinea pig again and test it and say, well, let's try it again, right? Like, I don't want hundreds of millions of more people to die. I don't want to try it again, and you're always going to have people that are corrupt at the top. They're going to take advantage and they're going to suck the life and the lifeblood out of the population as much as they can because they're corrupt. And that's not going to go away just because you have a different system in place. That's why our government is set up, not just the capitalist side of it, the free market side, but it's set up with checks and balances. That's the very reason why our founding fathers said, no, we need a 3-tier government that is able to balance itself, weigh itself, and provide accountability for itself. Now, it might be out of whack a little bit with the judicial system right now, but and maybe there's some things we need to fix. But at the same time, those checks and balances are there for a reason. And socialism, and especially communism, gets rid of those checks and balances, and you're not protected anymore, right? And it's just not a good outcome historically.
Yeah, exactly. And in America, we have, as God gives the rights, and the government their job is to protect the rights. And in a communist, they say no God, that the government is God, and so the government is what says goes. And that's why in China you have restricted versions of the Bible, and you can't buy and sell Bibles online. There's a Chinese Communist Party approved version of the Bible, and that's why they don't like it, because the Bible does not acknowledge government as God. In fact, government is an institution instituted by God that needs to do things God's way.
Right.
But this is actually just the next step in what DeSantis is doing. Is he had already, I think it was in 2022, put in place like a day of remembrance of the 100 million victims of communism. And so this is sort of the next step, at least, where they required 45 minutes of instruction on that day to be done in honor of the fallen victims and to be clear about the dangers of communism. And so I think this is just, it's great to get this into law, because that means actually this law was passed by the Senate, and then it had to go to the Education Department to do this. And so this is not something that the next governor can just come in and undo. But who knows what they can sneak in. But this should be going the right direction for now. And so I wanted to end on a very specific personal example of this. And so North Korea is another place that comes to mind. There's places that come to mind when you think of communism, but North Korea is one that is very real today. And if people are interested, I actually did an interview on my podcast, Cutting Edge Faith, a few years ago, and I think it was called Your Faith at Work at the time. But Cutting Edge Faith, I interviewed a North Korean defector. And so this is an interview with Grace Joe that goes over what it was really like living in North Korea. And I think I cried twice during the interview. It is insane what they experienced, what she experienced. I mean, she watched family members starve to death. She watched her father get killed by the government. She escaped to China to get rice and her dad used to go to China to get rice and come back. And then when he came back, if the government thought that he had left the country and come back, then they would beat him. And so it's illegal to even do that just to feed their own family. And so there's also penalties for smuggling food in, being exiled. And then we go over her story of her several attempts to escape the country and what it really took. And it took a miraculous event, like God's hand intervening to even get out of North Korea. And so there's labor camps, detainment in China. I mean, China works with North Korea. That's the reason North Korea can function the way they do, because China basically takes their rare earth minerals in exchange for keeping them just above board. So sometimes China will even pretend like they're helping people escape North Korea, but usually they're just sending people right back if they're caught. That is normally the case. And so I want to invite everybody to check that out. And then another one I did was with a man named Kenneth Bay, and that was Grace Joe, the first one that I did. And the other one was with Kenneth Bay, and he was actually a missionary that would go to North Korea and give tours of North Korea, and they allowed him in, but he would also bring in Bibles, and he got caught doing that. And so then he went to prison in a North Korean labor camp for 2 years, and he was what was considered a political prisoner. So he had 40 guards assigned only to him in this labor camp for 2 years by himself. And they let him read the Bible in a room so that they could say, like, it was a political prisoner. So they did this for theatrics to say, look, we're letting him read his Bible. We have freedom of religion here. And so they would leave him with his Bible there. But that's another example if you want to hear about what it was like being in a labor camp in North Korea for 2 years. Now, he was there by himself. He survived. The president of the United States at the time, I think it was Obama, there was an envoy that came and he ended up getting out. But the person that was in there next died within a couple months, I think. So it's very dangerous. It's very serious. We need to not be going toward the direction of communism. So if you want to hear those real stories of what happens when people starve and hallucinate, and I mean, it's tear-jerking, but we need to know the realities of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why we in the West are swallowing this ideology whole, especially the young people, is unfortunately we've made, in some ways, our culture has made, not everybody, but our culture has made tolerance and entertainment are gods. And so when you make tolerance your God and you say, we've got to be empathetic towards not just each individual, but every ideology, I believe we should be empathetic towards individuals. Absolutely. Whether they're a communist, or a Muslim or a Christian, or we should have empathy for people. Right. But at the same time, empathy does not equal a lack of accountability, right? If somebody murders somebody, I can feel empathetic for the hard situation they were in prior to that, but I am not going to not hold them accountable for that murder, right? They're still going to life in prison or getting the death sentence, either way, whichever one the court decides, right? And so there's the problem, is that we've become empathetic towards every ideology. And Charlie Kirk used to talk about how there's this idea of empathy suicide, or suicidal empathy, where you go so far where you say, we've got to tolerate every idea that's out there, including things like communism and Islam and all these things. And essentially what it says is every culture is equal. Now, I agree, every person is equal, every human being is equal, but not every culture is equal. Why? Because some cultures kill people as part of the cultural right, as part of the cultural. I mean, look at some of the ancient Mayan or Aztec cultures, like they would kill people as part of the culture, and they would torture them and they would sacrifice them. So it's like that culture, that ideology is not equal to another one that doesn't do that, right? It's not the same standard, like you have to have the same standard for every culture, but it's not the same result. We're not going to treat that culture the same way, and we're not going to allow that culture to influence us or to take over. Why? Because we are going to, as a society, are going to be in a worse place, right? And we've got to view it that way, and we've got to view empathy for what it truly is. Empathy is just the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Now, if somebody comes from that culture, right, and they believe that's right, I am going to love them, as a Christian, and I'm going to be empathetic to them to an extent, right? And I'm going to fight for their rights because they're a human being, the same way I'd fight for my own rights. But I am not going to allow the ideological breakdown of society in the sense of saying, oh yeah, that viewpoint that says that, we should commit jihad against anybody who doesn't convert is just as valuable as a viewpoint that says, that killing is wrong, or that murder is wrong. It's like those are two different things. So I think that's the problem. The other God is that we've made entertainment the God. And I think this has a lot to do with the rise of socialism, and that idea in the young is because when you start to value passion and hard work, and you see the how fulfilling that can be, like I am going to work hard at something I'm passionate about, right? That's like the entrepreneur mindset to an extent. Now I know entrepreneurship can get a bad rap. Sometimes it's like get rich quick scheme, and nobody wants that, right? Like that's not a positive way of doing that. But when you're working hard at something you're passionate about, that you get a fulfillment out of life and you enjoy your work. And if you're only working a job that you hate so that you can go binge the next Netflix show, and that's the most important part of your life, then of course it makes sense, to that, or to go to the next concert. Of course it makes sense that you want somebody else to foot the bill for your life and to pay, to pay your bills so you don't have to work as hard or you don't have to work as long or whatever. It's like, but I believe God designed us to be passionate creatures who do work hard and actually derive benefit out of our work, and I'm not trying to say you should never binge anything. It's like, I also believe in enjoying life in the sense of taking a break.
Yeah.
Right. But at the same time, I believe that we've made this entertainment God, we've lifted this entertainment God up so high that people have started thinking like, well, it would be better for me not to have to work towards a better means of living, or a better lot in life. Instead, if somebody just handed that to me, that would be better, right? That would be the best thing. And it's just not true, right? Because like even when you get wealth quickly, people show that it leaves quickly too. If you didn't work for it, you're not going to keep it around. It's going to go away quickly. And so that's the other problem with it, is if you just get a check every month, you're not going to view it the same way with the same value, and you're not going to steward it as well. And so I think those two things play in.
Yeah, it's not fulfilling. Like look at people who retire and they do nothing, and maybe for like a month, maybe 2 months, a few months, and they realize they need to be doing something. Now, a lot of people who retire, maybe they spend a lot of time with grandkids and they have that sort of fulfillment, but it's not the same as somebody who retires and then just sits on the couch. Like deterioration begins very quickly, and there's not. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing if they get a check handed to them, like and just relying on and not producing anything. And so the other thing is that money is a magnifier. Like you said, money comes in quickly, and it can leave quickly as well. It's not going to all of a sudden people become generous. And if they never gave with a little amount of money, like I said, it's a magnifier. And so, but we know for sure from history that communism is not the way to go. And we need to make sure that all of the young people in the United States and around the world really know that. And so this is the right direction. I can't believe we have to take this step, but we do need it. And I would say there's other worldviews as well that do need to be in the education system, where we're making sure we understand that really the biblical worldview is the only one that gets stronger under a microscope. It's the only one that really makes sense. And whether you call it the biblical worldview or not, it's the one that works. It's the one that is reality. It's the one that explains reality. And that's the direction we need to go.